Part 3 of the Introduction Overview. First, we will briefly cover the history of some major cataloging codes in Britain and North America, as well as international developments. The first cataloging code was developed by a British man named Anthony Panizzi at the British Museum Libraries. His rules set up a framework for later development in cataloging code. His rules included entry points to descriptions, like author entries and subject entries, which we now call access points. I think he had a pretty neat job title, Keeper of Printed Books. I may have to change my own title sometime like that. I recommend reading the Wikipedia entry about him. As it turns out, he escaped from execution and later became a knight in England. You never know about us catalogers. I might need to use him as an answer to the question, if you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be? One of the purported controversies in which he was involved was selling white mice on the streets of London. About a decade later, Charles Jewett at the Smithsonian Institute developed a cataloging code based on Panizzi's 91 rules. We see his major contributions in his recognition of standardization and uniformity. He also believed in National Library cooperative cataloging concepts. His ideas about alphabetical arrangement in catalogs have carried through. We saw them in card catalogs, we still see them in browsing, and we see them in indexing. And then a major advancement was made in 1876. Charles Cutter developed rules for a dictionary catalog, which covers, for the first time, his principles of cataloging. His objectives and principles of cataloging became a framework for the later development of AACR2 and RDA. His rules included descriptive cataloging, subject headings, and the dictionary cataloging concept. His rules also included authorship principles. The most important aspect of his rules was always the convenience to the public through cataloging. As you can see, cataloging rules were developed by individuals in the beginning, primarily serving the needs of the collections under their care, but with a desire for their rules to be used by others. But later, professional associations assumed the development. For the first time, the A.L.A. issued its first cataloging rules in the Library Journal in 1883. The 1902 revision aimed to connect the A.L.A. rules with Charles Cutter's rules in a way that made them conform with each other. The first International Cataloging Code, the first joint effort, was published in two separate editions in 1908. It was based on Cutter's original rules, but though it was published partially by the A.L.A., which had just brought its rules in line with Cutter's, the international collaboration initially lacked some agreement. The 1908 Cataloging Code was used until the 1940s. A preliminary second edition was used in 1941. This edition explicitly mentioned all of the disagreement between the first international editions, explained by notes. However, overall, it was criticized because it was considered too complicated. The later 1949 A.L.A. rules for author and title access points did not contain rules for descriptive cataloging. That responsibility then lay with the Library of Congress. Also in 1949, the Library of Congress issued its rules for descriptive cataloging separately. Likely desiring for the Library of Congress to take on the responsibility of directing the standardization of cataloging nationally, A.L.A. adopted L.C.'s rules and abandoned their own, though they did provide additions to help with resources other than books. There was a lot of criticism on the 1949 cataloging rules. A librarian named LUBETZKY'S at the Library of Congress published a detailed analysis of the 1949 code. He emphasized the principle-based code over the case-based code. As someone who complained loud enough, he was asked to assume the responsibility of simplifying the rules. He produced a draft code in 1960. His objectives are twofold. The first is to facilitate finding the location of a particular resource. This is the objective behind the known item search. If you know an author's name and you know the title, that is the known item search. The second objective is to relate and display together the editions which a library has of a given work. That is the objective behind the collocation function of a library catalog. In the 1960s, cataloging communities also joined the international movement. There was an international conference on cataloging principles in Paris in 1961. The major achievement of this conference was a statement of 12 principles, known as the Paris Principles, or sometimes the Paris Statement, that outlined the functions of the catalogs based on objectives of Cutter and Lubetzky. This was the first international conference that achieved an agreement between the U.S., the UK, and Canadian library associations. However, this code was limited to the choice of headings and entry words. There is no descriptive cataloging portion in this statement. As you can see, the result of this international conference was the first joint cooperative cataloging code by professional library associations that came out in 1967, named the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, or AACR. 2 editions were published, one as North American and one as British. It contained 3 parts, finally including descriptive cataloging. This code reflected the Paris Principles and Lubetzky's principles. It established that chief source of information for finding bibliographic data was the title page of a book. In the 1960s, we saw more library resources in non-book formats, so the rules for those were included as well. There was another important international meeting of cataloging experts in 1969. They established an international working group to develop the International Standard Book Description, ISBD. It was developed by agreement between IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and the Joint Steering Committee for the Revision of AACR. The main objective of this working group was to identify the elements of bibliographic description in their preferred order, with necessary punctuation. Now we understand a record created in any language, recognizing those elements of bibliographic information. Further, that working group developed ISBD for single resources, which we call monographs, and for series, etc. The major objectives of the standard were to standardize the format of descriptive portions of bibliographic records for all types of materials, allowing access to records regardless of language. It also allowed computers to handle the data more effectively as well. The Library of Congress didn't implement ISBD until 1974 because implementation is costly. Major rules seem to be revised every 10 years. The Joint Steering Committee for the Revision of AACR was established in 1974. The committee had representatives from A.L.A., the British Library Association, the Canadian Committee on Cataloging, and the Library of Congress. AACR 2 was issued in 1978. It included all of the official amendments, changes, and supplements to AACR. The second edition confirmed all of the international standards and the Paris Principles. It was issued in 2 parts, Part 1 for description of all types of materials, and Part 2 for authorized headings and access points. Looking at the history of various versions of AACR 2, the first revision was issued in 1988, the second in 1998, and the most current is from 2002. The main revisions in 2002 included renaming chapters 9 and 12. The most up-to-date version was released in 2005, and we used that version until the implementation of RDA. Issued separately by the Library of Congress were their interpretations of the rules, which applied to their work. Most of us also followed those rules, as they provided guidance in some confusing situations and helped us make certain decisions in our work. Modern cataloging practice is now intended to be based on the Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, or FRBR, a project of the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, or IFLA. FRBR is the conceptual model behind original RDA. The FRBR model includes 3 groups, dividing the bibliographic universe conceptually. Group 1 is the product of a bibliographic resource. Group 2 covers individuals or corporate bodies that are responsible for creating resources. Group 3 is about the content of a resource. The most recent FRBR report was updated in 2009. The International Conference on the Principles and Future Development of AACR was held in 1997, and a while after, In 2002, a Joint Steering Committee for the Development of RDA was formed. And finally, the brief history regarding RDA itself. RDA was originally conceptualized as AACR 3, but later was renamed Resource Description and Access, and its development began in 2004. It was first released in 2010. National libraries and a few volunteers began testing implementation, concluded in 2012 that it was okay, and participants announced that it would be adopted by U.S. national libraries. The first revisions were done in 2013, and the Library of Congress and other national libraries adopted RDA officially on March 31, 2013. IU libraries also agreed to adopt RDA on that day. The Library of Congress and its Program for Cooperative Cataloging have issued policy statements, the successor to LC's rule interpretations, and you can find those in the original RDA toolkit where you see the green button that says LC PCC PS. National libraries in other countries have policy statements, which are also accessible in the original RDA toolkit. Specialized organizations are also developing best practices to address the situations that pertain specifically to their content. The Music Library Association is the first to integrate those best practices into the original RDA toolkit, and the online audiovisual catalogers have a set of best practices that will also be integrated. As of December of last year, a new version of RDA is available. It is based on the IFLA Library Reference Model, or LRM. The original version is still available in a parallel iteration of the RDA toolkit and will remain in use throughout the country until at least 2022. The new version is a fairly substantial change, and policy statements have not yet been issued to address the changed content. While we will introduce the new version in this course, we will not cover it in great detail and will maintain use of the original version, as that is the version in practice in any library you may work in for a while. Full adoption of the new RDA version will take some time even after its formal adoption by the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, as learning the guidelines and adapting the systems will take time, and time equals money. As you go out into the field, you will also encounter local policies that further clarify certain situations or address the needs of local stakeholders. Those policies may apply across a consortium of libraries. For example, there are policies that libraries in Ohio must use to ensure that their content is findable and accessible to all users of the OhioLink system. That way, you can perform a search how you want, and it will work the same way no matter where you are in Ohio. The same goes for the institution where you work. Indiana University, which has several campuses throughout the state and several branches on the Bloomington campus, has policies about how to handle certain situations, like whether the archives of traditional music and the music library use the same record for the same book, or if they have to use separate records. For this class, we will be using class policies, which we'll discuss for each assignment. You will see in any local policy situation that those decisions do not always match your personal beliefs, but the cooperative nature of our field is such that questions and discussions are always welcome.